October 20th, 1944. 0500 hours aboard the Japanese heavy cruiser Tone, Philippine Sea. Commander Takeo Shibata lowered his binoculars with hands that had begun to tremble, not from fear, but from the terrible comprehension of what he was witnessing. Through the pre-dawn darkness, American carrier silhouettes were visible against the eastern horizon, and from their decks, aircraft were rising into the sky with a mechanical precision that defied everything he understood about naval aviation. In his 14 years of service, Shibata had participated in nearly every major carrier operation of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had been at Pearl Harbor, had survived the Coral Sea, had witnessed the catastrophe at Midway, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was observing now. The Americans were launching aircraft faster than seemed physically possible. Every 90 seconds, another fighter roared into the darkness. Every 2 minutes, another dive bomber. The deck crews moved with choreographed efficiency, bringing aircraft from hangar to catapult to sky in a continuous flow that never paused, never hesitated, never slowed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Shibata could not fully grasp in that moment was that he was witnessing the culmination of American industrial engineering applied to the ancient art of naval warfare. The Essex-class carriers that formed the core of Task Force 38 represented more than just ships. They embodied a completely different philosophy of carrier operations, one built on mass production principles, standardized procedures, and the assumption that speed of launch mattered more than the individual skill of any single pilot or deck crew member. By the time the sun rose that morning, American carriers would launch over 200 aircraft in less than 30 minutes, a feat that Japanese carriers, even operating at peak efficiency with their most experienced crews, could not remotely approach. The mathematics of this disparity would prove more decisive than any tactical maneuver or strategic brilliance. When one force can put aircraft over the target while the enemy is still spotting planes on deck, the battle is essentially over before the first shot is fired. The journey to this moment of absolute American superiority had begun 3 years earlier in the design bureaus of Newport News Shipbuilding and the Brooklyn Navy Yard. In January 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had laid down the keel of USS Essex, the lead ship of what would become the most successful class of aircraft carriers ever built. The design specifications were ambitious: 27,100 tons, fully loaded, length overall of 872 feet, beam of 147 feet at the waterline. Most critically, the Essex class would carry between 90 and 100 aircraft, nearly 50% more than the preceding Yorktown-class carriers. But raw numbers of aircraft told only part of the story. The real revolution lay in how these ships were designed to handle those aircraft. Naval constructor William Francis Gibbs, who had consulted on the Essex design, understood that carrier warfare would be won or lost not in the climactic moment of combat, but in the prosaic details of aircraft handling. How quickly could planes be brought from the hangar deck to the flight deck? How efficiently could they be armed and fueled? How rapidly could returning aircraft be struck below to clear the deck for the next launch? These questions, seemingly mundane, would determine victory or defeat in carrier battles where minutes mattered and seconds could be decisive. The Essex class incorporated 3 aircraft elevators, compared to the 2 found on most Japanese fleet carriers. More significantly, one of these elevators was positioned at the deck edge on the starboard side, rather than cutting through the flight deck centerline. This seemingly minor design choice had profound implications. With a deck edge elevator, aircraft could be brought up from the hangar while flight operations continued on the main deck. Japanese carriers, with their centerline elevators, had to halt all deck operations whenever moving aircraft between hangar and flight deck. The implications of this design difference compounded across every launch cycle. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack and was now serving on Admiral Ozawa's staff, had studied intelligence photographs of Essex-class carriers with growing concern throughout 1943 and 1944. In post-war interrogations conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Genda revealed just how thoroughly Japanese naval planners had misunderstood what they were facing. "We knew the Americans had more carriers," he stated in October 1945. "We knew they were larger and carried more aircraft. What we failed to comprehend was that these ships were designed as aircraft launching machines. Every aspect of their design prioritized getting planes into the air quickly. Our carriers were designed as mobile airfields. The American carriers were designed as weapons factories. This philosophical difference manifested in dozens of specific design features. Essex-class carriers had 4 steam turbines generating 150,000 shaft horsepower, giving them a top speed of 33 knots even when fully loaded. Japanese fleet carriers like Shokaku and Zuikaku could manage 34 knots, but only when relatively light. More importantly, the American ships could sustain high speeds for extended periods due to superior engineering and damage control systems. Speed mattered for carrier operations because launch efficiency depended partially on wind speed over the deck. The faster a carrier could steam into the wind, the shorter the takeoff roll required for each aircraft. Essex-class carriers routinely operated at 30 to 32 knots during launch operations, generating effective wind speeds of 40 to 45 knots across the deck. This allowed even heavily loaded strike aircraft to become airborne in distances that would have been impossible for Japanese carriers operating at lower speeds. The deck itself represented another critical advantage. Essex-class carriers had a flight deck 360 feet longer than Japanese fleet carriers, and significantly wider. This additional space allowed deck crews to spot more aircraft simultaneously. A typical Essex-class launch might spot 30 to 40 aircraft on deck, armed, fueled, and ready for immediate launch. Japanese carriers, with their smaller decks, typically spotted 20 to 25 aircraft maximum. This meant that even if Japanese carriers could launch aircraft at the same rate as American ships, which they could not, they would still need multiple deck cycles to launch comparable strike forces. But the launch rate itself told the most damning story. Essex-class carriers, operating with well-trained deck crews, could launch one aircraft every 45 to 60 seconds during surge operations. The process was mechanized and standardized to an extraordinary degree. Aircraft handlers wearing colored jerseys, each color denoting a specific function, moved planes from the elevators to the catapults in precise patterns that had been drilled until they became automatic. Fueling crews connected hoses and pumped aviation gasoline with mechanical efficiency. Ordnance handlers loaded bombs and belted ammunition with procedures, refined through thousands of hours of practice. The flight deck officer, standing on the bridge with a clear view of the entire deck, coordinated these movements with hand signals and radio calls that kept aircraft flowing toward launch position in continuous sequence. Japanese carrier operations, by contrast, remained dependent on highly skilled individual deck crews executing complex maneuvers that required years of training to perfect. Pre-war Japanese naval aviators and deck crews had indeed achieved extraordinary proficiency. The Pearl Harbor Strike Force launched 183 aircraft from 6 carriers in approximately 15 minutes, a stunning demonstration of operational excellence. But this excellence depended on veteran crews who knew their ships intimately and had trained together for years. By 1944, those veteran crews were mostly dead, killed in the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign and the catastrophic losses at the Philippine Sea in June. The replacement crews now manning Japanese carriers had minimal training and virtually no experience. Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto, a deck officer aboard carrier Zuikaku in October 1944, kept a diary that was recovered after the war. His entry from October 15th, 5 days before the Battle of Leyte Gulf, revealed the desperate state of Japanese carrier operations. "We attempted a full deck launch exercise today," he wrote. "It took us 43 minutes to launch 32 aircraft. The deck crew made numerous mistakes. 2 aircraft were damaged in handling accidents. The captain was furious, but what can we expect? Half the men have been aboard less than 2 months. They do not know their jobs. "We cannot compete with American efficiency." This represented the true crisis facing the Japanese carrier force by late 1944. Even if Japan had possessed carriers equal in design to the Essex class, even if Japanese industry could have produced aircraft in incomparable numbers, the training deficit was insurmountable. American deck crews trained for 6 months before being assigned to operational carriers. They then continued training daily aboard ship, running endless drills until every procedure became muscle memory. Japanese deck crews, by contrast, received perhaps 6 weeks of training before being rushed to fleet assignments. The contrast extended to the pilots themselves. American naval aviators in 1944 received approximately 600 hours of flight training before joining operational squadrons. This training included extensive practice in carrier takeoffs and landings, gunnery, navigation, and formation flying. Japanese pilot training programs, decimated by losses and desperately trying to generate replacement aviators, had been compressed to less than 100 hours by late 1944. Worse, fuel shortages meant that even this minimal training was often conducted in aircraft that barely flew, with student pilots sometimes receiving more time in training mock-ups than in actual planes. The industrial context that enabled American carrier superiority extended far beyond the ships themselves. In 1944, American shipyards completed 9 Essex-class carriers. Japanese shipyards completed 0 fleet carriers. By war's end, the United States would commission 17 Essex-class carriers, plus 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls. Japan would commission 1 fleet carrier, Tai-Ho, which was sunk by submarine attack on its first major operation, the Philippine Sea battle in June 1944. The production statistics were so lopsided as to seem almost fictional. American factories produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Japan's entire aircraft industry produced 28,000 planes that same year, many of which were obsolete designs or suffered from quality control problems due to lack of skilled workers and shortage of strategic materials. Every Essex-class carrier launched represented not just steel and machinery, but the accumulated industrial capacity of Detroit's automotive plants, Pittsburgh's steel mills, and thousands of manufacturing facilities across the United States that had converted from peacetime production to weapons manufacturing. Commander Shibata, watching from Tone's Bridge as American carriers prepared their strike that October morning, had no detailed knowledge of these production figures. But he could see their results. Through his binoculars, he counted 15 American fleet carriers in visual range, each launching aircraft with mechanical precision. The Japanese mobile fleet, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, now possessed exactly 4 carriers: Zuikaku, last surviving veteran of Pearl Harbor; Zuiho and Chitose, light carriers with small air groups; and Chiyoda, a converted seaplane tender barely worthy of the carrier designation. More critically, these 4 Japanese carriers embarked a total of 116 aircraft, including obsolete types and a large percentage of pilots with less than 100 hours flight time. The 15 American carriers Shibata was observing embarked over 1,300 aircraft, every one a modern design, every pilot thoroughly trained. The battle that would unfold that day, October 20th, 1944, would become known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. But for the carriers, the outcome was preordained by mathematics so overwhelming that tactics barely mattered. At 06:15, Admiral William Halsey, commanding the American Third Fleet from Battleship New Jersey, gave the order for a full strike against the Japanese carrier force that his reconnaissance aircraft had located 200 miles to the northeast. The carriers of Task Group 38.3, under Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman, immediately began launching aircraft. USS Essex, the class namesake, spotted 40 aircraft on deck, armed and ready. At 06:20, the first Hellcat fighter began its takeoff roll. 60 seconds later, the second fighter launched. The process continued with mechanical efficiency, one aircraft after another roaring down the deck and climbing into the morning sky. The deck crew moved with practiced precision, bringing aircraft from the elevators, respotting them for launch, hooking them to the catapult bridles, and sending them aloft in continuous sequence. By 0645, 25 minutes after the first launch, Essex had put 42 aircraft into the air and was preparing to launch additional aircraft from a second deck spot. USS Lexington, operating as flagship for Task Group 38.3, matched this performance, launching 40 aircraft in 23 minutes. USS Princeton, a light carrier with a smaller air group, launched 18 aircraft in 11 minutes. Across Task Force 38, the story repeated at every carrier. USS Enterprise launched 36 aircraft in 21 minutes. USS Franklin launched 40 aircraft in 24 minutes. USS Intrepid launched 38 aircraft in 26 minutes. The total strike force, launched from multiple carriers across several task groups, numbered over 200 aircraft. The entire launch sequence, from first plane airborne to last plane joining the formation, consumed approximately 34 minutes. Commander Shibata, observing this launch through Tone's fire control optics, felt something close to despair. The cruiser's communications officer had intercepted American radio traffic and was attempting to count the aircraft being launched based on radio call signs. The preliminary count exceeded 150 aircraft, and the launch was still underway. Shibata knew that the 4 Japanese carriers, even operating at maximum efficiency with experienced crews, would require at least 90 minutes to launch their entire air group of 116 planes. By the time the Japanese strike aircraft were airborne and formed up, the American aircraft would be overhead, dropping bombs and torpedoes. The tactical situation was hopeless. Aboard Zuikaku, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa faced this same terrible mathematics. His carrier force had been sent north deliberately to lure Halsey's carriers away from the main Japanese battle fleet approaching Leyte Gulf from the west. The plan had worked perfectly. Halsey had taken the bait, bringing his entire carrier force in pursuit of Ozawa's decoy carriers. But Ozawa had not anticipated how quickly the Americans could launch their strike aircraft. Japanese intelligence had estimated American carriers could launch approximately 25 to 30 aircraft per hour per carrier. This estimate, based on pre-war observations and outdated intelligence, was catastrophically wrong. Ozawa's chief of staff, Captain Toshikazu Ome, would later write that the speed of the American launch surprised everyone on Zuikaku's bridge. "We observed the American formation through our optical equipment," Ome recorded in his post-war memoir. "We could see aircraft launching continuously from multiple carriers. The efficiency was frightening. Our own launch operations had barely begun. We had 26 aircraft on deck, and the process of spotting them was chaotic. The deck crews were young, inexperienced, uncertain. I realized in that moment we were going to be destroyed before we could launch half our air group." This realization was accurate. By 0700 hours, American strike aircraft were forming up in large coordinated groups, with fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers assembling into the strike formations that would attack the Japanese carriers. Japanese carriers were still attempting to complete their launch sequence, with aircraft handlers struggling to move planes from hangar to flight deck, fuel crews connecting, hoses, ordnance crews loading weapons. The mechanical efficiency that American carriers demonstrated was simply absent from Japanese operations. At 0745, the first wave of American aircraft appeared over the Japanese force. Ozawa's carriers had managed to launch approximately 70 aircraft by this point, but they were scattered across the sky in small groups, attempting to form up into coherent strike formations. The coordination that should have been handled by experienced air group commanders and flight leaders was breaking down because most of those experienced officers were dead, killed in earlier battles. The American attack was devastating in its efficiency. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Franklin targeted carrier Zuikaku, the Pearl Harbor veteran that represented the last link to the Imperial Navy's glory days. The first bomb struck at 0751, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar deck as aviation gasoline ignited and ammunition detonated. A second bomb hit 40 seconds later, followed by a third. Within minutes, Zuikaku was dead in the water, listing heavily, fires raging through her interior spaces. She would sink at 09:15, taking over 840 men with her. The light carriers fared no better. Zuiho took multiple torpedo hits and sank by mid-morning. Chitose suffered bomb damage that caused catastrophic fires, sinking in the early afternoon. Chiyoda was crippled by bomb hits, and later finished off by American cruisers. By evening of October 20th, the Japanese carrier force had ceased to exist. All 4 carriers were sunk. The 116 aircraft they had embarked were destroyed or scattered. Over 2,000 Japanese naval personnel were dead. American losses in the carrier battle were minimal. Princeton was sunk after being hit by a single dive bomber that penetrated her defenses, but this represented the only American carrier lost. Aircraft losses were moderate, with most attributed to anti-aircraft fire rather than aerial combat. The kill ratio in the air battle was approximately 15-1 in favor of American aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of Leyte Gulf demonstrated conclusively what had been evident throughout 1944. American carriers had achieved absolute superiority, not just in numbers, but in operational effectiveness. The Essex-class design, combined with well-trained crews and superior aircraft, generated combat power that Japanese forces could not match. Admiral Ozawa, rescued from the sinking Zuikaku and transferred to a destroyer, filed his final report on October 22nd. The document, preserved in post-war archives, is remarkable for its blunt assessment of Japanese failure. The American carrier force demonstrates technical and operational superiority in every category, Ozawa wrote. Their ships are faster, larger, and more survivable than ours. Their aircraft are more numerous and more capable. Their pilots have superior training. Most critically, their launch procedures allow them to put overwhelming forces into the air before we can complete our own launch operations. This advantage is decisive. No amount of tactical skill or fighting spirit can overcome the material disparity we face. The report continued with specific observations that Ozawa's staff had compiled based on the battle. American carriers launch aircraft at approximately 3 times the rate of our carriers. Their deck crews perform their duties with mechanical precision that does not require years of training. Their procedures are standardized and simplified. Any reasonably trained sailor can perform the required tasks. Our procedures require highly skilled specialists. We no longer have those specialists. They died at Midway, in the Solomons, at the Philippine Sea. These assessments, written by one of Japan's most capable naval commanders, represented clear-eyed recognition of reality. The war of carrier aviation was over, and Japan had lost comprehensively. The industrial and training advantages that enabled American carriers to launch 200 aircraft in 30 minutes were advantages that Japan could never overcome. The factories that produced Essex-class carriers were completing new ships faster than Japan could sink existing ships. The training programs that generated American naval aviators were producing pilots faster than combat could kill them. The replacement pilots arriving at carrier squadrons in late 1944 were better trained than the pilots they were replacing, because American training programs continuously improved based on combat lessons. Japanese replacement pilots were worse trained than their predecessors, because Japan's training programs had collapsed under pressure of losses, fuel shortages, and lack of time. Commander Shibata survived the war and lived until 1987. In interviews conducted by historians in the 1970s and 80s, he frequently returned to that October morning when he had watched American carriers launch their strike. "It was the moment I understood we had lost," he stated in a 1981 interview. Not just lost the battle, but lost the war. The Americans had industrialized naval warfare in ways we couldn't comprehend until we saw it. They treated carrier operations like a factory assembly line, standardized, efficient, mechanical. We still operated like craftsmen, dependent on individual skill. When you can launch 200 planes in 30 minutes, and your enemy requires 2 hours to launch 100 planes, the outcome is inevitable. This industrial approach to carrier warfare extended beyond just the ships and their crews. The entire American naval aviation system was designed around mass production principles. Aircraft were manufactured in enormous quantities, with standardized parts and simplified maintenance procedures. Spare parts were abundant, flowed through logistics networks with predictable efficiency. Damaged aircraft could be repaired quickly because replacement components were readily available. Japanese naval aviation, by contrast, operated on scarcity principles. Every aircraft was precious because replacements were scarce. Spare parts were in perpetual shortage. Maintenance took longer because mechanics had to improvise solutions rather than simply swapping out damaged components for new ones. This scarcity mentality affected tactical decisions in ways that compounded Japanese disadvantages. American carriers could afford to launch large strike forces because they knew additional aircraft could replace any losses. Japanese carriers had to husband their air groups carefully because losses were essentially irreplaceable. This caution translated into smaller strike forces, which were less effective and more vulnerable to American defenses. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviators was devastating. Pilots who had grown up in a culture that emphasized spiritual strength and fighting spirit over material factors found themselves in a war where material factors were overwhelmingly decisive. No amount of bushido, no degree of determination or willingness to die, could overcome American radar that detected aircraft at 150 miles. American fighters that were faster and more heavily armed, American carriers that could launch overwhelming strikes before Japanese pilots had even reached their aircraft. Lieutenant Kaneyoshi Muto, a fighter pilot aboard Zuikaku during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, survived the sinking and was picked up by a Japanese destroyer. His diary, recovered after the war, contained entries that revealed the profound demoralization of Japanese aviators by late 1944. "We are asked to fight with inferior equipment, inadequate training, and no hope of victory," Muto wrote on October 18, 2 days before the battle. "The Americans have everything. We have nothing but our willingness to die. But death without purpose is not sacrifice. It is waste. We are being wasted." Muto would die 3 months later, flying a kamikaze mission against an American destroyer. His death, like those of thousands of other Japanese aviators in the war's final months, achieved little strategic effect. The suicide tactics adopted by Japan in late 1944 and early 1945 represented recognition that conventional carrier warfare had become impossible. The technological and industrial superiority of American carriers, combined with the training advantage their crews possessed, made traditional naval aviation combat suicidal for Japanese forces. The Essex-class carriers that so thoroughly dominated the carrier warfare in 1944 and 1945 would serve the United States Navy for decades after the war. Several underwent extensive modernization programs in the 1950s, receiving angled flight decks, steam catapults, and other improvements that allowed them to operate jet aircraft. USS Lexington, commissioned in February 1943, served as a training carrier until 1991, a 48-year career that saw her conduct more than 493,000 arrested landings, more than any carrier in history. USS Intrepid became a museum ship in New York City, preserved as a testament to American naval power. These ships represented more than just military hardware. They embodied an approach to warfare that treated combat as an industrial process, where victory came from efficiency, standardization, and the ability to generate overwhelming force faster than the enemy could respond. The revolution in carrier operations that the Essex class represented changed naval warfare permanently. Modern, aircraft carriers, whether American, French, British, Chinese, or Indian, all incorporate principles first demonstrated by Essex-class ships in 1944. Multiple aircraft elevators, deck-edge elevator positions, large flight decks designed for rapid launch cycles, extensive maintenance and repair facilities, abundant spare parts storage, all trace their lineage to the Essex-class design philosophy. The Japanese admirals, who were stunned by the ability of American carriers to launch 200 aircraft in 30 minutes, were witnessing the birth of modern naval aviation. The speed of launch wasn't a tactical trick or a temporary advantage. It was the manifestation of industrial power applied to military operations. American factories produced Essex-class carriers using mass production techniques. American shipyards built these vessels with standardized components and modular design principles. American training programs generated deck crews who could operate with assembly line efficiency. The entire system was designed around the premise that speed and volume mattered more than individual excellence. A mediocre deck crew on an Essex-class carrier could outperform an excellent crew on a Japanese carrier because the American ship was designed to make difficult operations routine, while Japanese carriers required exceptional skill to achieve even adequate performance. This democratization of military excellence, this transformation of warfare into an industrial process, represented something historically significant beyond just the specific battles of World War II. It demonstrated that modern warfare would be won by nations that could mobilize their entire industrial capacity, that could treat military operations as scalable processes rather than tests of individual valor. The samurai spirit that Japanese naval officers emphasized was admirable in many ways, but it was irrelevant in a contest against an opponent who could simply produce more ships, more aircraft, more pilots, and more of everything else needed for victory. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Hawaii, understood this dynamic perfectly. In a speech delivered to naval officers in December 1944, Nimitz articulated the philosophy that had guided American carrier operations. "We do not ask our sailors to be heroes," Nimitz stated. "We ask them to be professionals who execute their duties competently. We do not require our pilots to seek glorious deaths. We require them to destroy enemy forces and return safely. We do not demand that our ships fight to the last man. We demand that they accomplish their missions and survive to fight again." This professional military ethos, combined with overwhelming material superiority, proved devastatingly effective. The contrast with Japanese military culture was stark. Japanese naval tradition emphasized that death in battle was the ultimate honor, that survival was shameful if it came through surrender or retreat, that material factors were less important than spiritual strength. These beliefs, deeply embedded in Japanese military education and culture, made it extremely difficult for Japanese commanders to acknowledge the true nature of their situation. To admit that American carriers could launch aircraft 3 times faster than Japanese carriers was to admit that the war was lost. To acknowledge that American industrial capacity was overwhelming was to concede that Japan had made a catastrophic strategic error in attacking the United States. These admissions were psychologically difficult for officers who had been taught since childhood that Japan was a divine nation destined for greatness, that the emperor's forces were invincible, that American democracy bred weakness and inefficiency. The reality that American democracy had produced the most efficient military machine in history, that American industrial capitalism generated overwhelming material power, that American training systems created supremely capable military personnel contradicted everything Japanese military culture believed. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Some Japanese officers, like Admiral Ozawa, managed to see reality clearly and report it accurately. Others could not accept what they were witnessing and continued to advocate for tactics based on spiritual strength overcoming material disadvantage, even as such tactics led to catastrophic losses. By November 1944, American carrier forces were operating with complete impunity throughout the Western Pacific. Essex-class carriers launched strikes against targets in the Philippines, Formosa, and even Okinawa, with minimal opposition. The few remaining Japanese carriers, lacking aircraft and trained pilots, remained in port, functionally useless as combat vessels. The carrier war was over. The killing would continue for 9 more months, through kamikaze attacks, through the Okinawa campaign, through the final devastating air raids against Japanese cities, culminating in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But carrier versus carrier combat, the defining form of Pacific naval warfare from 1941 through 1944, had reached its conclusion at Leyte Gulf. The Essex-class carriers had demonstrated absolute superiority, and that superiority derived fundamentally from industrial organization and systematic efficiency rather than tactical brilliance or individual valor. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.